Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Art Institute of Chicago, to beautiful Fullerton Hall. I'm Fawn Ring, and I'm the Director of Lectures and Performances here at the Art Institute, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Department of Museum Education. We're delighted to have you here this evening. Tonight, I wanted to begin by just, doing some of the basics. Don't forget to turn off your phones, and just be aware that because this is raked so steeply, if you are checking them, it also can be really distracting to your neighbors, so just be aware of that. Also, we handed you a survey card when you came in, and we are trying very hard to get to know who you are, what you're interested in, and so if you wouldn't mind taking the 60-second survey and either turning it back into one of us at the doors on the way out, or you can just go ahead and leave it right on your seat, if that's easier for you, okay? Tonight, I'm very excited to have the privilege of welcoming Edmund DeWaal, one of the world's leading ceramic artists. He studied English at Cambridge University and ceramics in both England and Japan. He's best known for his large-scale installations. Those have been seen in museums all around the world. His work comes out of a dialogue between minimalism, architecture, and music, and it's informed by his passion for literature. His recent work explores ideas around collecting and collections, how objects are kept together, lost, stolen, or dispersed. As you probably know, he's also a celebrated author who's written widely on art and ceramics. His 2010 family memoir, The Hare with Amber Eyes, combined memoir, biography, art history, and a wonderful detective story, and it captivated readers worldwide. The New Yorker called it the most enchanting history lesson imaginable. It's been translated into nearly 30 languages, and it's won many literary prizes. Well, he's here tonight with his new book called The White Road: Journey into an Obsession. After he talks with us, we will have some time to do audience questions. We'll bring some microphones down into these stairways here, and you can line up and ask some questions. And after that, there will be a book signing. Books are for sale right now out in the lobby. And he'll sign the books right here on the stage. So if you wouldn't mind at the end, just go ahead and line up so that you can come across the stage this way. So without further ado, let's join Edmund DeWaal on his journey into obsession. Please give him a warm Chicago welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a huge pleasure and a huge privilege, and I don't think I've ever talked under a golden dome before. I mean, it's the most extraordinary thing. It's so off-putting. It's marvelously, beautifully, obsessionally off-putting. So I might just stand here and look at this golden Chicago dome. Or not. Or perhaps I'll tell you about my life. My obsessional life. A life of thinking and making around objects, which began when I was very young indeed. I was 5 when I made my first pot. I persuaded my poor father to take me to an evening class. And I went down the stairs into the cellar. For some reason, potters always put in cellars. It's a very great mystery. And there was a potter's wheel, and I picked up clay, and I made a very lumpy bowl. And the next week, I went back, and the teacher of ceramics said, "What color, dear, do you want your bowl to be?" There's a whole spectrum of different glazes, different oxides, different paints you can make your bowl. And I said white. And 45 years later, I'm still making white pots, which seems to me a pretty convincing reason to try and work out what this particular journey into obsession is, and to really ask this very real question: what is this thing of whiteness? As Moby Dick, what is this thing of whiteness? Why make objects which have this colour or this absence of colour, and put them down in the world, and why come back to it again and again and again? In London, I have an old ammunition factory for a studio, and one end of the studio is my potter's wheel, and this small, slightly monastic space is where I make my pots. And then at the other side of the studio, high up, this is far too clean and tidy, it's been scrubbed up for photographs, it's actually a terrible mess, with piles and piles and piles of books. I have a library, and I have a Chinese chair and a Donald Judd chair and lots of pencils and lots of notebooks and 4,000 books. And on my shelves, I have various shards, broken pieces of porcelain that I've collected along the way. I have books and fragments, all muddled up together. And this is my working life. My life is spent walking between making and writing. And in both of these places, I scribble on the walls like a 5-year-old. Every single surface has notes and ideas and possibilities and titles and parts of poems and things I've come across and notes to remember what I should be forgetting. What is this thing of whiteness? And as you can see here, with my terrible handwriting, there are lots of lists. Because I decided as I approached middle age that I needed to do a journey to try and work out what this obsession with porcelain really meant. Why was I still using this beautiful, seductive, clean, fugitive material? This amazing material that had been invented in porcelain, invented in China 1,000 years ago, and has haunted the world ever since. Why make it? And I decided on a script for my journey. I would go to 3 white hills on pilgrimage. The first white hill being in China, the place where porcelain began 1,000 years ago. The second white hill being in Germany, where porcelain was discovered in Meissen in the 18th century. And the third place, a favourite white hill in Cornwall, where the slow English decided much later to try and have a go as well. 3 places of pilgrimage, and I made a list: London, Plymouth, Venice, Dresden, Cornwall, Stoke-on-Trent, Jingdezhen, the city of porcelain, Istanbul, Dublin, North Carolina, Beijing, Allach, West Norwood, Rome. Crossed out. I didn't get to Rome for no good reason. West Norwood being the dull suburb where I make my pots. But if you go on a journey, you need a guide. And the great thing about guides is you can choose really badly. But I chose really, really well. I chose a Jesuit. Now, Jesuits are this is advice for free. Jesuits are very, very good people to go on journeys with because they're extremely tidy. They're very good at lists, very good at note-making, and they don't drop their footnotes. And this Jesuit who I chose was an extraordinary French Jesuit from the late 17th century. It was the moment when Jesuits are being sent all across the world to make the world Christian, and also to go deep into the cultures where they were landed and send letters home. And my Jesuit, Father d'Entrecol, was sent out from Limoges, a countryside of porcelain in France, of course, all the way to China. It took him 9 months. And in a very plaintive letter I found in the archives, he says, "Do you know, I rather regret not dying en route. It was so awful." And this poor man, this young Frenchman, ends up in the city of porcelain. And he's an extraordinary witness. He's an amazing witness. He talks to people. He notices what people are doing. He asks them questions. He walks around the streets, and he sends letters home. So for my first witness, my first guide, I go off to Jingdezhen with photocopied letters of this extraordinary 18th century Jesuit. It sounds wildly pretentious, but damn it, that's the way I do things. And so I go off into the mountains on the first day, up into the first white hill, and it's extraordinary humid day, and I look down under my feet because there's a crunch, and there is a Sung dynasty bowl, 1,000 years old, gone wrong. And I just am struck. It's my great epiphany. And I notice that my guide is laughing because when I look up, the whole hillside is filled with thousands and tens of thousands of broken porcelain pots. It's a whole landscape of brokenness. It's a whole landscape of all the things that go wrong with porcelain. Here is my shard. I keep it in my pocket. It's a bit more uncomfortable than keeping a netsuke in your pocket, but it's still something which is real. And when I look at these incredible broken pots under my feet, I feel real kinship, because when you pick up porcelain, when you compound it out of these two different clays you need to bring together to make this beautiful plastic white material, it goes wrong. Contamination happens. When you make it, put it down on the wheel and you start to throw, it warps and moves around like anything. If you can take your pot off the wheel and put it in the kiln, it will crack, it will go wrong, it will shiver or shake. If you try and glaze it, it will go wrong too. That's the DNA of porcelain, things going wrong. So on this hillside of brokenness, I feel really, really comfortable. I know what they're doing. And this is my first white hill. This is where 1,000 years ago they started to dig the clays and then carry them down the mountainside and put them on boats, and then these boats came down this wonderful, lazy river to Jingdezhen. And Jingdezhen, for 1,000 years, has been this. It's been a place, this is the riverbank, with millions and millions of broken pots. It's a whole city where, according to a wonderful record by a poet who was sent there, and a rather complaining poet. There's lots of actually rather complaining Chinese poets. No one talks about this. They're always being very depressed Chinese poets. My particular depressed Chinese poet says that this city, this is a wonderful photograph from 1920, this city there was no change between night and day. Day was full of smoke and fire, and night was full of clouds and fire from all these kilns. He said it was like a fire mouth of hell. And this incredible city was packed with 100,000 people making pots. Everywhere you went, you saw pots. You saw people grinding cobalt, this very haunting photograph from an American in 1920 showing a man grinding cobalt. It would take him days and days and days, working late to grind it. And he talks, my Jesuit talks of the incredible poverty, that every single place in this city of porcelain, people were stacking porcelain and they used to move it at the last minute to prevent it getting broken. And when I went there, the railway tracks were being used for porcelain. 1 train a day, 5 minutes warning, all the children rush onto the track to move the pots off before the train comes through. And my Jesuit talks of seeing men carrying pots and wheeling pots through the streets, this wonderful fat Buddhas being gingerly moved. This man, my heart was in my mouth. The pavements of Jingdezhen are like New York. They're absolutely appalling. Imagine tripping with this cargo of porcelain on your cart. But wherever you go, you see porcelain. These are kids painting huge porcelain pots. I asked them how much they got paid. They said enough for cigarettes and a mobile phone. And everywhere, pots. Pots, pots, pots. And the people who make them are working in dust. And this is the strange and terrible thing about porcelain, that when you make porcelain, every time you touch it, a little element of silica comes off. The dust is poison. It's called in every country potter's rot. You breathe in this white dust and it takes a little bit of your life away. And every street you go down, you see eddies and eddies of dust. So why do it? Why make porcelain? You make porcelain because it's staggeringly beautiful. It's staggeringly beautiful. This object is my first white object in my book. It's a Tibetan monk's cap ewer. It was made in Jingdezhen for an emperor. And this is in the Met. It's an extraordinary object from the early 14th century. It's the whitest thing in the world. The man who owned it said it was as white as sugar. And when you look at it, you see the compulsion, the obsession with porcelain, beginning to see how this is coming together, because the man who wanted this beautiful white object was a terrible, terrible emperor, a man who slaughtered thousands of people, but wanted white objects in the center of his life, wanted to create a pagoda of porcelain to celebrate his parents in commemoration of his parents. This was a pagoda 275 feet high, which he made out of white porcelain, putting lamps which glowed every night so that the whole of Nanjing could see one single white object glowing in commemoration of his parents. Who could not be obsessed with porcelain? And this incredible porcelain tower, everyone goes to see it. So, of course, my Jesuit, my young French Jesuit, goes to see it, and he writes a letter home. And this letter says, I know how to make porcelain. I've seen people do it, and I've seen what they do with it. And this letter arrives in Europe, and it's translated into every single language, so that everyone knows that porcelain is being made in China and that the secret can be unlocked. And when his letter gets read out in Versailles to the Sun King, Louis XIV, Louis XIV decides that he too wants a beautiful building of porcelain. So in Versailles, he makes not a pagoda, but a porcelain pavilion for his mistress, the new mistress that he loves, Montespan, and he makes a porcelain pagoda. But they don't know how to do it. So they get Delftware, and it leaks, and all the Chinese painting on the ceiling drips, and the silks are moldy, and he starts to dislike the mistress, and after 20 years, this beautiful porcelain pagoda is destroyed. But this is obsession. This is a moment of obsession. If you want porcelain, you want to be surrounded by porcelain. You want to have it everywhere. And this building is also a place of pilgrimage, this lover's nest. Everyone comes to see this ersatz, this fake building of porcelain. And this is where my second person comes in, my second unlikely avatar, the second person who I fall in love with in my white road journey. And he really is a very, very unlikely person to fall in love with. He's a German mathematician, and if you can think of anything more unlikely as a person to fall in love with, please see me afterwards. And not a particularly good-looking one at that. But he was young, and he discovered in the middle of nowhere, on the family estate somewhere near Poland, that he could understand mathematics, that he could find joy in abstract thought. And this young man, the Count Chernhaus, almost no money, decides to take himself off all the way around Europe and learn about philosophy and learn about mathematics. And this is a slightly embarrassing picture because this ludicrous bit of Latin, mathematics, is his first attempt to understand how light works. And my embarrassment here is that I bought it for a huge amount of money from an antiquarian bookseller. I don't understand Latin, I don't understand maths, but I decided I needed to have it in my hands. I'm a big believer in having things in my hands. So luckily my wife is back in London and doesn't know quite how much I spent on this absurd piece of paper. But this young mathematician who loves thinking through problems takes himself off around Europe, and he sits at the feet of incredible philosophers and scientists, including Newton, who says to him, have you thought about how lenses work, how light moves? And so this young man learns how to make lenses, and he builds this beautiful, beautiful lens. It's as big as this. It's as big as this. And it's absolutely incredible. It's a vast, vast lens. And what he does with it is to let light come through and see how it burns materials. What happens when actually you put clay or metal or anything natural under the beams of the sun? Materials change. And he decides that what he wants to do with this extraordinary knowledge is to make porcelain. He decides that the big question mark that everyone wants to know, the great secret he wants to unlock, is the secret of porcelain. And because he's a young man, and because he has no money, he decides he's going to take this knowledge, this query, and go to the court where there's more money and more knowledge and more hunger for porcelain than anywhere else. He goes to Dresden. And Dresden is incredible. This is 1700. It's a city of palaces. It's the city of this extraordinary man, Augustus the Strong, who is a man who famously has 472 illegitimate children, changes his mistress by the week, builds palaces for them and forgets them and locks them up, loves horses, loves fighting and battles, and also has the Porzellankrankheit, the illness, the sickness for porcelain. When he comes to Saxony, when he inherits the throne of Saxony, there is 112 pieces of porcelain in the treasury in Dresden. And when he dies, there's 38,742. He loves the stuff. He sends people off to Amsterdam to buy it, but he can't buy it quickly enough. He has this dream of sending a boat. He's completely mad. He has an idea of sending a boat all the way down the Elbe, all the way down to the Baltic Sea, all the way around Europe, all the way to China, so he can buy his own cargoes of porcelain. But most of all, he wants his own porcelain manufactory. He wants someone to make porcelain for him. And into this court comes my amazing philosopher, and into this court comes alchemy. Into this court comes a young alchemist who's been caught out in Berlin trying to make gold out of lead. And this alchemist is called Böttger. And here is a picture of him looking absolutely like a Hollywood star of the third degree. He's an absolutely terrible man. I think it's the unbuttoned shirt that does it for me. But he really is an absolutely appalling character. It's very difficult when you meet someone in history who you really take against. But this man really is awful. He's a trickster. He's a fraudster. He's a dreamer of dreams, certainly. But he's someone who always tries to get his own way. And admittedly, there's some reason for him to be unhappy because he's locked up. He's locked up in this extraordinary castle in Meissen in a rather damp and disgusting cellar until he can make porcelain. But actually, when you read his letters, of which I have, there are 7 volumes of these, they are just one complaint after another. Nothing is too bad for Böttger. Everything is miserable. But he has a talent. He has a feeling for materials. He has a sense of what might happen if you bring different materials together. So he and my philosopher start working together to try and make not gold, but porcelain. And finally, after 7 years, they make black porcelain. It's wrong, it's beautiful, but they've worked out something about how materials work. And then an extraordinary 6 months later, these are the notes from their kiln. Number 5, optime album et pellustum, the 5th, the best white and translucent. They open the kiln in that castle in Meissen, and there it is. English porcelain, no, European porcelain. It weighs nothing. It's translucent. It lifts into your hands. They've unlocked the arcanum. They've made porcelain for the emperor. And what happens? 2 days later, Tschirnhaus dies. And when they go to seal his room, all his papers have gone, all his books have gone, all his notes have gone. And Bürger arrives at the palace of the king with the beautiful white cup and says, "I alone am the inventor of porcelain." So there's a film. He's a terrible man. There he is, showing off to Augustus the Strong, and my wonderful philosopher disappears from history. So Meissen porcelain is invented, and on the base of every single Meissen pot, when you pick it up, which you should, are these two rapiers crossed, the two ciphers that prove that this pot has been made in Meissen. But what happens? What happens is this. Everything turns gold. Everything becomes colour. Augustus the Strong wants rooms of porcelain. He wants things which are almost Chinese, almost Japanese. He wants harlequin figures. He wants swan services. He wants things for every celebration going. And the whiteness disappears. This, I have to say, is something I would describe best as passive-aggressive porcelain. What's white about that? Where is this thing of whiteness? But that's my second white hill. That's my second place in my journey. This place where the idea of porcelain becomes a reality in Europe. And for my third place, I come back to England. And I come back to a chemist. And here he is, also not a particularly good-looking hero. And this one is a Quaker, William Cookworthy, a rather foursquare, modest man of great belief who sets himself up as a chemist in Plymouth. Now, Plymouth, as none of you will know unless you've actually lived there, is the dampest place in Britain. And I found that his neighbour had a first barometer in England and records that every day there is either rain, more rain, or a greater rain. So this poor chemist here, William Cookworthy, with his spectacles in his hand, just having written a letter, spends all his life being damp. But he's very good at thinking about things. And he goes off to Cornwall nearby, and he goes into this landscape where everyone is digging things up, where there's minerals everywhere. And he walks up this beautiful hillside, and he notices that there's white clay under his feet. And he takes home this white clay, and because there's nothing to do in Plymouth in the evenings except read, he's read these Jesuits' letters, and he starts to think that actually he too can invent porcelain. And he builds a little kiln in his backyard. And with his brother, he gets the quest for perfect porcelain. It takes him 40 years. And very movingly, I found these samples, these shards, in an envelope of a letter in an archive in the middle of nowhere. And it takes him 40 years, but finally, one day, he opens his kiln, and there, March the 14th, 1768, CF, Cookworthy Feckett. I made it. Cookworthy made it. And on this mug are the arms, the coat of arms of Plymouth, very badly painted in cobalt. It's all run. You pick it up. It weighs a ton. It's about as far away from Chinese porcelain as you can imagine. It's nothing like Meissen porcelain. And bless him, William Cookworthy's first pot is an ale tankard. And it's out of date. But he's tried and he's succeeded in making something. And so on the Plymouth docks, what does he make? He makes heavy jugs and heavy tankards, and he makes models of cows sitting down in the grass, which he tries to sell here and there, and tries to make a manufactory. He tries to make porcelain work in England. And I can promise you, that's very hard work. I should know. And then he makes a huge mistake. As you can see from this image of him reading the Bible with his wig on in his oak chair, he's more of a scholar than an entrepreneur. But he decides that he's going to patent porcelain. And so he puts out a patent for William Cookworthy of Plymouth for the sole use and exercise of a discovery of making porcelain. And this is a huge error, because all the way up in Stoke-on-Trent, a brilliant entrepreneurial potter who sees everything, sees what he's doing, and decides to destroy my Quaker. It's Wedgwood. Never cross Josiah Wedgwood. Wedgwood is a man of many parts. He is a man who builds canals to make his ceramics go from one end of the country to another. He's a man who's a friend of every member of the Royal Society. He's making pots for the Empress of Russia. He's an artist, he's a potter, he's a man of trade, and he's certainly not going to let William Cookworthy in the docks of Plymouth get this mystery of porcelain patented. And so he destroys him. He forces him to disclose all his knowledge, and he goes down to Cornwall and he buys the hills of porcelain. And then, because he's a man who wants ownership of the world, he hears a rumor, an extraordinary rumor, that the other side of the world, in the Appalachian Mountains of Carolina, the Cherokee Indians are using white clay. And this is one of the strangest stories ever. He's heard that the Cherokee Indians use white clay and that it's kaolin. It's the kind of things that you can make porcelain out of. And because he wants no one but himself, no one but Wedgwood, to own this material, he sends an adventurer off on a ship all the way across the world to Carolina to bargain with the Cherokees and buy the clay. It's an extraordinary story. This man arrives in the terrible summer, having survived bandits, outlaws, and sits down with Cherokee Indians under the lee of this white hill and says to them, "I will buy some of your clay from you." And they say, "It's sacred. We don't want to sell it. This is the clay that we use for our ritual purposes. This is the clay that we need. White for us is a ritual color. We don't want to sell." And Wedgwood's emissary says, "I'll take a bit of your clay and come back and give you porcelain." And they sell him the mountain, and he disappears with 5 tons of their sacred clay. So I go to the mountains to try and find the clay. And up in the Appalachians, in the red earth, finally, I find the last bit of the Cherokee clay. It's an extremely poignant moment for me. I'm there with my oldest boy. I've taken him out of school on a ridiculous research trip. You can always take your children on research trips in England if you kind of make the school believe that they're serious academic research. I take him deep into the Appalachian Mountains, and we find this beautiful seam of white porcelain clay. And then, as a kind of restitution, I've brought a small Wedgwood cup from 1780, which I give back to this particular landscape. It's a bit ridiculous, but there you go. Because every single piece of Wedgwood's porcelain after 1770, all those famous dinner services have one speck of Cherokee clay in them. So talk about restitution. That's an extraordinary story. And what does Wedgwood do? He buys the mountains and he turns them into mines. He turns villagers into workers making porcelain bricks. And Stoke-on-Trent becomes another Jingdegen. Travellers to Jingdegen talk about the day and night being one, and travellers to Stoke-on-Trent in the potteries of England say exactly the same thing. And travellers to Stoke-on-Trent say that when you look left or right through every doorway, you see children working in the dust, because that's what happens in ceramic factories. Everyone works in dust. What is this thing of whiteness? I thought that I'd finished my journey. I'd added an extra white hill in the Appalachian Mountains. I thought that was a pretty good end to the book. And I thought that I would do a coda, a little postscript about my love for modernism, my love for Bauhaus pots, the wonderful, extraordinary attempt to bring into focus the modern world through clean forms, through stackable pots like this, through articulated form. I thought what I'd do was end on a wonderful high of talking about modernism. So I'm thinking about the Bauhaus, like I do, in the middle of the night. Some people think about other things, but I think about the Bauhaus. That's my problem. And I'm thinking about a favorite designer called Wilhelm Wagenfeld, who's a wonderful industrial designer. And I'm looking him up, because I can't sleep, because I've been drinking too much coffee for too long, too much of my life, for too many decades. And I see that he worked in a factory called Allach in Germany. Now, I think I'm pretty good as an obsessive, and I think that I knew every single German porcelain factory that there was, and there are quite a few. You can test me afterwards if you're being very unkind. But I've never heard of Allach. And I find that it was near Munich, and that it was set up in the late 1930s, and that it was hugely successful. And I start to worry about Allach. So I go to Allach, and I find the derelict factory in a suburban street with a big notice saying, "Keep out," which I disregard, and climb over a chain-link fence, thinking that I'm an extra from The Wire, but there we go. And I walk across, and I peer into this derelict factory. And I found out that this factory was moved in 1940 to Dachau concentration camp, because this factory was set up by Nazi functionaries to make pure Aryan porcelain, because porcelain is a good German material, because porcelain is white, because purity is what art should be in the Third Reich. And that Himmler, who loved porcelain, had seen the factory and decided that he'd move it to a place where he could have more control over the manufacture of his favorite material. And that in Dachau, the porcelain was so successfully made that as the Third Reich moves east, special Allach shops in these extraordinary cities which are emptied, as the ghettos are emptied, Allach porcelain factories are moved in. And that in Dachau, Himmler brings visitors to see slave laborers making porcelain, making white bowls, making figures, as you can see, of people on horseback, SS functionaries, and most chillingly, this particular model of the fencer which was only given to the commanders of concentration camps. Here's Heydrich, who set up the extermination policies of the Third Reich, who chaired the Wannsee Conference, with his favorite statue, a porcelain statue, a white porcelain statue of a fencer. And here is Hitler on his birthday, seeing the new Allach porcelain figurines that have just arrived from Dachau concentration camp. It brings the question of whiteness up into a very different place. Why purity? What is going on with this obsession with porcelain? Why emperors? Why Augustus the Strong? Why Louis XIV? And why Himmler? What is going on with whiteness? And in Dachau, as I'm working there in the archives, reading these terrible transcripts, these terrible lists of the workers who were forced to work there, Himmler's letter saying that he wanted workers from all concentration camps across the Reich who knew about porcelain to be sent to Dachau. The archivist says that a new piece of porcelain from Allach has just arrived for the archive, and they bring in a laundry basket with an object wrapped up in newspapers, and it's Bambi. And I turn it over, and there is the Allach mark, which is the double runes of the SS, a transposition of Meissen mark. What do you do with that? It's an object of terrifying sentimentality. It's kitsch. But the cost of this kitsch, the cost of making something so sentimental out of porcelain, rolls back the question of whiteness, of purity, into a much more dangerous and difficult place. Porcelain isn't just about sentimentality. It's not just about collectibles. It also has a cost which is extraordinarily high. It takes you back into the history of the White Road, into all those people who have not chosen to make things, but have been forced to make things. What do you do with that kind of knowledge? What do you do when you've been obsessed with porcelain all your life and you're taken to that kind of place? This is what I do. I make things. I make things out of porcelain and I bring them together in groups, which are called installations, which is a horrible, technical, arty word. What do you call these kinds of groupings of poems? This is what I made after Dachau. It's a piece called Breath Turn. It's a kind of response to the poetry of an extraordinary poet called Paul Celan, whose parents died in the Shoah, who wrote about what it is to try and think your way into whiteness. His poems are full of the whiteness of homecoming, the whiteness of snow, the whiteness, as he says, of the hair that my mother never had. Where do you put porcelain in the world where it can have some kind of resonance, where it can be taken away from this quotidian moment and brought somewhere else? I try and do this. I make installations, groupings, which you can walk over. These are pieces for the University of Cambridge. It's a series of underground vitrines you can walk over and look down and see broken porcelain pots and gilded fragments. And sometimes there are leaves on these, and sometimes there's snow, and sometimes people walk without looking, and sometimes they stop. And I make things to hang in the air. This is an installation called Atmosphere that I made for a very beautiful new museum by the sea down in Margate, Turner Contemporary, a building that was built on the place where Turner used to paint. The sea is there in front of you, and there's a huge landscape of clouds. But I wanted you to be able to just see the weather, to see pots in mid-air, a kind of cloudscape. And I make things which are behind glass, which are held in some kind of safety. I'm very interested in safety. I'm very interested in how collections move, about diaspora of objects, about how you can pause a collection, bring things together, put them in a vitrine with glass, and just let them be in the world for a while. I have my own collection of Netsuke, which were in a vitrine over 150 years. They are paused briefly with my family. And the idea of how a collection can hold itself together for some time in one place is something that matters to me, as does music. This is called Composition for Three Voices. These are the pieces I've just finished making. I'm about to show them in Los Angeles in 6 weeks' time in the new year. And they're all about music. This is my devotion to John Cage, the way of bringing serendipity together. This is a series of almost empty vitrines where there's just, let me show you, a piece of porcelain, a piece of white painted lead, and a bit of gold. It's a series of sounds for me. And these are sounds too. They're ways of hearing the world. When I see words and when I see pots, I hear things. This is the 10,000 Things for John Cage. This is 20 black aluminium boxes, each with a piece of Corten steel, and 3 black pots. And when I see it, I hear it. I hear the sound of the Corten going down into the aluminium case. I hear the pot being placed and replaced. And here is my English paean to LA weather. This is what I think of Beverly Hills. The weather, it's always blue. But there's a question for me about placement. And there's a question for me about making pots and putting in the world, which is profoundly about home, about belonging. And last year, I had the strangest invitation possible. It was from Vienna. And some of you may know that for me, Vienna is a tricky city. The invitation was from the Kunsthistorische Museum, which is an extraordinary and beautiful museum on the Ringstrasse. It's also the museum where all my family's art was taken in the weeks after the Anschluss. It has a certain history. But they also have a small neoclassical temple on the Ringstrasse, the Theseus Temple, where they make installations of art. And they said, make us an installation in this park, in this temple. And I thought, what do I take back to Vienna? So I made them a poem. I made them this poem. It's called Lichtzwang, Light Duress. It's a poem by Paul Celan, the great Jewish German poet of the fragment. And I put it up in this extraordinarily beautiful empty space, and I wrote on the wall the poem. And this is really just a poem. It's 220 syllables, 220 words. And there they are, and I leave this installation for 7 months in Vienna. And the doors are opened every day at 8 o'clock, and they close every day at 6, and people wander in, kids with their mums, and tramps with their bottles of wine, and a not very good dance troupe make a very moving and not very good dance piece in celebration of it, and the art critics hate it in Vienna. But briefly, there is this poem of Porcelain in the middle of Vienna, Lichtzwang. And then I make a black version, Black Milk, which I'm about to show in LA. That's what I do. I try and make poems with porcelain. I try and work with music and architecture and spaces and porcelain. And right at the heart of it is this question, this attempt to understand this thing of whiteness, this idea that porcelain has history. Porcelain is this moment of encounter between a person who's touched clay, a place where that clay came from, and time. I know that everything will end up as a shard. That's not a bad idea for all of us. But the question of the white road, the journey into obsession, begins and ends with people and whiteness. Thank you. Thank you very much. Occasionally I did get terribly distracted by that dome, which is so beautiful. I kept losing my place. There may be no questions, but if there is a question, I'd be delighted to try and answer it. Hooray, a question. Yeah, of course you.
I'm sure you've seen the Percival David collection.
Yes.
And how did that influence you as when you first saw that collection?
So I'm being asked about, do I know the Percival David collection, and what was my response? The Percival David collection is the greatest collection of Chinese ceramics in the world. And it's in London. And I first went there when I was 10. And the great thing about the Percival David collection in the old days was that it was in a very beautiful Georgian townhouse in a square in London. And you rang the bell, and an incredibly grumpy woman used to come and let you in and say, "What do you want?" And you go, "Well, I've come to see the porcelain." They say, "Why?" It's a terrific gatekeeper to prevent you coming to see porcelain. Then you had to sign in, and then you went up these stairs, and there was barely any light. But in the vitrines was this amazing porcelain, incredible porcelain, the collection of a great diplomat who'd gone to China and taken everything he could find back to London. What did I think of it? I haunted it. So much of my adolescence was spent not chasing girls and drinking beer, but making pots from the Percival David collection badly on a wheel. So yes, the Percival David collection matters. And now it's in the British Museum, and there's no one to tell you off. And you can go up to the Chinese galleries, and you don't have to sign in. You can wander around and look at it. And idiotically, I slightly resent it. There's something about making things a little bit hard, which I really shouldn't say that. I'm a trustee of the V&A. I believe in full access to art for everyone. But there is something wonderful about finding things all by yourself. Thank you.
Thank you.
This gentleman here?
So my obsession
Yeah.
is terracotta, which has a longer history
Yes.
than porcelain. Porcelain actually comes from it.
Yes.
So do you have any thoughts on the relationship? It's a little more proletarian.
So this gentleman here has a parallel obsession with terracotta, and he's pointed out two things. One, that is older than porcelain. Let's get in that in quickly first. Absolutely. And second, you use the word proletarian? Proletarian. Well, that's a good combative start to any question. That makes porcelain patrician and all kinds of other stuff. I love terracotta. Terracotta is immediacy. Terracotta is that wonderful red, rich, open clay. It's it has a different kind of texture where porcelain is fine. Terracotta has a robustness to it. You can expand when you do terracotta, work with terracotta. So of course I love it. Of course I love it. I'm pretty Catholic in my likes. I'm pretty definitive in my obsessions, but I'm very Catholic in what I like. And I'm delighted that someone obsesses about red clay. Here. It's at the Gagosian Gallery, and it begins in the middle of January. And if any of you guys are around on the 12th of January, I'm talking at the Getty about other things. But see you there. Any more hands? Or we can all go to the... Oh, here.
I have a question for you. As you were traveling around the world and finding all of these areas where there was porcelain, could you characterize, is there a difference between the quality of clay and porcelain? Do you prize one over the other?
So this is a question about the difference between different porcelains all around the world, and I prefer? Is there a hierarchy of desire? So how many hours have we got? We can have a what's called a lock-in in English terms, which they do in pubs, where they lock the door. Okay, I've got a couple of hours before I need to get on a plane again. Yes, they're all profoundly different. They share extraordinary. There's an extraordinary adamantine line going through all of them. They share qualities, but there are huge differences in terms of warmth. So, for instance, when you pick up a piece of porcelain, Japanese porcelain, and you have a piece of Chinese porcelain, and you have a piece of Sèvres, there's a different warmth to the porcelain. They have a different. They're very at a sort of in a bodily way. It's extraordinarily difficult to actually characterize it, but I try in my book to actually define the difference in qualities of these different porcelains. Because, of course, every time you make porcelain out of different clays, there's going to be a molecular change between different kinds of porcelain. So English porcelain and French porcelain and Chinese porcelain are different, but they all have this, at the heart, the same idea. It has to be light, it has to have translucence, it has to have purity. But actually, there's a warmth between the different ones. Which do I prefer? I use a Limoges porcelain, which is an incredibly sentimental choice. It's rather embarrassing, but entre nous. The reason I use Limoges porcelain is that not only is it beautiful and ridiculously expensive, but actually I love having bags with Limoges. In the middle of suburban South London, Limoges makes me think of being warmer. Up there?
As you gained more knowledge and you went through this journey, did your obsession wane or did it intensify?
A rather challenging question about whether my obsession waned or waxed on this journey. Do you know what? It's just got worse. I mean, in the sense that actually, I think at some level, I was setting, when I started this sort of pilgrimage to these hills, I jokingly said it's a midlife crisis, and we'll leave that to one side. But I did actually want to work out why I used this clay, whether or not I had a few more decades in me of using this clay. And the reality is that it gets deeper for me. It gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And the reason for that is that there is, at the heart of my love for this clay, the fact that when you make something of it, you're absolutely caught in the present moment. When you make it, there's a total absorption in now. the nowness of making something, because it's a beautifully immediate clay. At the same time, there's an incredible resonance with the past. I'm totally in history when I use it. The Percival David collection, objects from Meissen, wherever. So I'm both in the present moment and very much in the past. And as I go on my journey, and it gets into a darker story, that takes me, obviously, into parts of the narrative which I'd prefer not to be in, but I'm now in them too. So more obsession, and a bit more. I think that might be it for us. I think that might be it. But thank you so much. Thank you.